Welcome, my name is Russell. I'm an interpreter here in the Powhatan at Jamestown Settlement, and today we're going to be talking about making stone arrow points, much like this one here. So today what we're actually going to be talking about or discussing at length is going to be the creation, use of late woodland style stone arrow points, sometimes referred to as projectile points in a larger class there. And so much of them in this period and in this region, the late woodland period as it's referred to, are going to be small woodland triangles. This is what they're sort of known by class, but that's really referring to points like Clarksvilles, Madisons, Yadkins, things like that, which would take on a shape much like one of these here. Small triangular point, in this region commonly made from quartz or quartzite or some other imported stone, and really topping out at their maximum size, something like this. So not much larger than a quarter at any point. There's a couple of reasons for that. Largely these are fired from a longbow at big game, and so these small points cut a wide enough swath into whatever your target is that the arrow meets little to no resistance, but they remain small enough that they don't add too much weight to the front of the arrow. In fact, modern hunting broadheads are actually coming back to be about just this size because it's a very effective form and style for the function that's intended. And so I mentioned these points being made largely from quartz and quartzite. That's the locally available knappable stone. And so knappable really referring to the fact that these stones can be broken somewhat predictably because they have a high silica content, making them closer to glass than they are to granite. And so obsidian, flint, chert, rhyolite, quartzite, or in this case sometimes quartz and quartzite that's locally available or traded for, would fall into this range. So it can be chipped into shape with a bit of skill and make incredibly fine edges, which can actually be resharpened and reused time and time again. And so we're going to go ahead here today and actually work through the process of making one or a few of these to show step by step, taking the stone from either a small cobble found possibly on a local beach, or even taking it from a larger core traded up and down the rivers, actually breaking it down little by little into a point like this, which can then be used. So flint knapping, for the most part, will of course begin with the material you're working, in this case a large core of novaculite, a type of chert not native to this region, but used heavily by flint knappers nowadays because of its accessibility and its also ease of use in creating stone tools. It's also an incredibly sharp material when in its finished form. Your tools you're going to need, flint knapping is really broken down into largely percussion flaking, or actually striking with an implement, and pressure flaking, or actually applying pressure to the edge and snapping off a piece. And so you're going to need tools for percussion flaking. This one here, referred to as a billet, is actually made from the antler of deer, moose, elk, things like that. White-tailed deer would be your dominant one probably in much of the eastern woodlands, particularly dense, hard material. And ones like this, which are more white in color, commonly ones that are actually dropped from the animal while it's still alive, tend to have a lower moisture content and actually deliver more impact to the stone with less wear on the tool. Other percussion flakers would commonly be simple stones like this, of a grade a little tougher, more durable than your flint knapping material. So it could be a simple river stone of many different varieties that could be used for this. And then your tools for actually pressure flaking will commonly be also antler, but in this case an antler spike. This one really unrefined, simply the actual antler from the deer that I can apply pressure to the edge of my material with. You could also see smaller reduced pieces of antler, which are commonly mentioned worn by many of the men of the eastern woodlands on their wrist or at their waist to actually sharpen points and blades in the field very rapidly. And then one that's used a little more nowadays in modern flint knapping that is not entirely backed or found in the historical record is what's referred to as a handled pressure flaker or an ishi stick. And commonly what this allows is you're mounting the antler or the pressure flaker in this point into a long piece of wood to allow greater leverage in creating or driving flakes into the tool. These largely come about because of the fact that many of your traditionally made stone blades and tools have just tremendous skill and particularly long flakes across the face, or actually for the hafting or other purposes of the tool. That is incredibly challenging to make using something short in the hand like this. You're going to need to apply some sort of mechanical advantage or much greater force behind it, which would almost necessitate the use of something like this, probably occurring all over different parts of the continent. And then, commonly overlooked one, this nice leather pad or something like it to go ahead and protect my legs when I'm doing initial percussion flaking, and then a small one like this that I might actually seat in my hand to protect my hand when I'm doing pressure flaking, to avoid driving those small sharp flakes into my palm. We're starting here with this large piece of novaculite, a chert, not local to this region as mentioned before, but particularly effective and also popular with flint knappers nowadays. So what I'm going to do is take this antler billet or hammer that we mentioned earlier and physically strike along the edge here. Now these flakes, and actually doing this, I'm going to be shattering pieces off onto the underside from the force. Not all of these flakes will necessarily have the thickness and uniformity that you want for making an arrow point or another type of tool. However, each one of them is going to have a razor's edge, much like a broken piece of glass. And so small stone flakes not used for arrow points and knife blades would still find heavy use in butchering of animals, food preparation, cutting rope, and doing all kinds of other things until they dull or wear out and can simply be discarded. So I'm going to work my way down the stone, and at least one of these ought to produce a flake with the right thickness and size that we're looking for actually making a point. So now you can see the worked edge here with all of the scars that have been driven off of the stone here, and we can go through this pile of flakes and sort of look them over. You know, something like this, probably not the best suited for a point. Something long like this, make a fabulous flake tool for butchering. All this edge here being nice and uniform and incredibly sharp, even sharp enough to be used for, you know, cutting hair and doing all kinds of other things, but still not particularly wide or uniform for making a point. And so comes down to some of these in here, which would certainly be suitable for the job. Doing a couple thinning flakes there, cleaning up the edge on some of these would probably make a nice suitable stone point. And so we'll pick through and see if any of these flakes will end up turning into a nice point. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move down to a much smaller percussion flaker, just a simple river stone here, and physically remove a fair bit of material in short order by actually just striking along the edge here where it's thin. And so since this flake is particularly thin on the edges, like most of them are, my initial strikes with the stone here are really not to thin out the tool any, which is a consistently important technique. However, at this point, because it's so thin, all I'm really doing is reducing the shape, and as we get closer in on the material and we're actually creating the point, that's when we'll want to make flakes that actually cross the tool to give it sort of a flaked appearance like this, keeping it nice and thin like these points that you can see will still be effective. A knife blade like this here really sort of highlighting the technique that we're talking about, driving long flakes across the material to create the tool, keeping the shape but also making sure that it stays thin. And you'll notice as I'm doing this flaking, I'm constantly swiping away the leather pad, cleaning it off, because many of these very small shards that may or may not be visible are incredibly fine, like bits of broken glass. And so leaving them on here while I'm physically striking or putting pressure between my skin and the pad could embed these sharp flakes into the skin. So constantly sort of swiping it away is a simple safety measure that keeps me from getting cut by any of the waste left behind. And so what I've been doing so far is taking the thick edge of the flake where the original impact actually drove it from the stone, sort of thinning out the base. The thinning of the base is incredibly important, because no matter how fine the point may look, if the base is too thick to actually fit into an arrow shaft or into the handle of whatever you're going to haft it to, then it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. It doesn't create a smooth transition for use as an arrow point or another type of tool. So coming through and driving some flakes off to thin that base, and then really getting the base thin and uniform enough to haft, and then from there actually outlining the tool. There are plenty of different ways to go about doing something like this, and with flint knapping being one of the few traditional skills that has seen a resurgence in modern times, there are fabulously skilled flint knappers nowadays, really many parts of the world, and you're going to see probably just as many thoughts on how to craft different types of tools traditionally in the late woodland period as you see nowadays. Lots of different versions and ideas of how to go about it, but the finished product really being the key thing. So with the base sufficiently thin, and go ahead and get back to putting a little bit of work around to shape the tool itself.
do is you take rounds. Come on, when you blend or slate, you can make really, really sharp forks. And so like you can cut like, it's cut as sharp as like a knife is to that. Yeah. You know, a metal knife.
Why don't we just do that?
Well, it takes a lot of work and you have to be really skilled at it. Like, so make all these little places that rub it on yourself so you don't cut yourself. Because it's all these tiny little places. And if you do a single place that goes off, you become a killer. So it's really fun. Now, depending on your speed, some people you reduce the stone.
Sorry, we talking too much.
That's pretty cool, right?
Now, being a little bit cautious in this material with my actual percussion flaking, with the stone sort of tapping back and forth, because although the novaculite, this type of chert here, makes incredibly fine edges, much like obsidian, it is more glass-like obsidian, so it won't tolerate quite as much stress from impact from a harder material like a quartz or a rhyolite that might have been more commonly used in this area. Could stand up to a whole lot more percussion flaking or striking of the material without generating any serious fractures. So being a little more cautious with this to sort of bring it into shape for probably another 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and sort of pressure flake it to the finish line. So now that we have kind of the rough shape of the point, with this material being a little more fragile, what I'm going to go ahead and do is transition over to the pressure flaking and sort of run up and down all the 3 edges here, back and forth, flipping the stone from time to time to go ahead and shoot for a point which will have a fairly even or complete bit of scarring across the entire tool. The scarring, the thinning flakes like that, creates a tool that in cross section has more ridges to it, but also those ridges can be actually helpful in deflecting impact or energy. So let's say if this is as a finished point to strike an animal or a bone or a piece of wood or something like that, having those ridges will allow the energy imparted into the stone to have sort of breaks or checks along the way, whereas a completely unscarred flat piece of stone of this material would more than likely shatter in that case. So it does not only thin the tool and make it a little more smaller in cross section, but it also adds sort of lines or ridges that can help diffuse the force of impact to make it a more effective, longer lasting tool as well. using this larger hammerstone here to actually grind away some of the very fine sort of razor sharp edge, because the tip of the pressure flaker, in this case the antler, doesn't always seat as well on such a fine glass-like edge, so providing a little thicker base to actually apply pressure into the stone from. So at this point I can either bring this edge all the way over to this sort of nicely flaked edge to make that triangle that I'm looking for and bring the base underneath to match it, or I can bring this edge, which is nicely flaked but a little thicker, over to sort of meet this edge, keep the base fairly close to where it is. So that's what we're going to go ahead and try to do, is take this edge via pressure flaking and bring it over a little bit, make it more of a triangular point based off of this edge. Bring that one in, keep the base pretty close to where it is. The base at this point is pretty nearly set, and in the sort of cross section you can see is still close to the thickest point of the point, although the center is a little thicker. You can see, however, that that base is thin enough that it will very easily be accepted by the grooved or carved out end of the arrow shaft, which is key. Without a thin enough base to actually half the point is largely useless. Nothing more than something to look at. So now that the base is pretty fairly set to the way it will be, I will go ahead and work my way up and back across the edges here until it refines it into more of the triangular shape, kind of like so. So with the sort of finished product here, you can see I have a woodland style point, really not much larger than the head of my thumb, or you could argue a quarter. It has a base thin enough to be well hafted. It has its thickness sort of concentrated in the middle, although not quite a clean, perfect ridge you'll see on some of them that are very well done, or the stone is a little agreeable. But the weight concentrated in the middle, the base still thick enough for stability, but thin enough to be hafted. And then you got these nice uniform edges, bringing not into a sort of dramatic, very narrow triangle, but a fairly sort of consistent triangular edge with lots of little teeth. And some of these edges along this point will be finer depending on the grade of stone than steel edges can be brought to. So some of these points being incredibly sharp and leaving it a little more lobed or sort of wider edged than you might imagine. We could narrow this up. Allows for use and reuse of this point. So this point still has a width well more than thick enough to actually cut a path thicker than the arrow, let's say on its pass through a deer or bear, causing tremendous penetration of the arrow and great damage. But as these edges, let's say, nick bone or hair and all throughout the life of this point, I can come back with a little antler spike and simply chip off a piece here or there and use this point again and again until it gets small enough that it may fall out of service for big game and be used for things like ducks and geese and stuff like that. So this would be a fairly typical idea of a woodland triangle point here, napped with stone and antler tools, and ready for hafting onto a foreshaft or straight onto the arrow, depending on the use. Well, thanks for watching and joining us today while we talked about and displayed the process for making woodland triangle stone arrow points like this. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below.